Richard Blake, a millionaire investor, was about to miss his flight when a battered old taxi pulled up. The driver looked exhausted, and beside him was a young boy, his son. What the investor saw next changed his life forever. He watched the driver hug the boy tightly, whisper something, and send him off with teary eyes. Curious, the investor canceled his trip and followed the taxi. What he discovered about the man's life was shocking, heartbreaking, and ultimately beautiful. And what he did next? It left the entire city speechless. This story will touch your soul and make you believe in humanity again. Before we start the story, leave a comment to let us know which city you're watching from. Like and subscribe to support our community. Your support means a lot to us. Now, enjoy the story as we continue. It was a cold morning in downtown Chicago. The streets were buzzing, people were rushing to work, and the sky was painted in shades of gray. At the heart of it all stood Richard Blake, a 48-year-old self-made millionaire. He checked his watch for the third time. His private jet was ready, but the car he ordered had still not arrived. His driver had canceled last minute, leaving Richard scrambling for a ride. Frustrated, he hailed a nearby taxi. The yellow cab was old, rusty, and looked like it had seen better days. But Richard didn't care. He had meetings in New York. Time was money. As the car pulled over, Richard opened the back door, ready to bark at the driver. But what he saw stopped him. A man in his late 40s sat behind the wheel, eyes tired but kind. Beside him stood a young boy, maybe 10 years old. The driver hugged the boy tightly, whispered something into his ear, and gave him a small lunchbox. The boy nodded, wiped his tears, and ran off toward a nearby school. Richard paused, something about the moment gripping his heart. But he brushed it off and got in. "Airport," he said curtly. The driver nodded, merging into traffic. Silence filled the cab for a moment. "Was that your son?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, sir. He's everything I have," the driver replied, his voice soft but proud. Richard didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Then his phone rang. His assistant, Vanessa. "Sir, your meeting got pushed to tomorrow due to bad weather in New York." Richard hesitated. "Turn around," he said suddenly. The driver blinked. "Sir, don't go to the airport. I'm not flying today." "Where to then?" Richard looked at him. "Wherever you're going." The driver's name was Michael. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove. The man in the back seat, dressed in a $1,000 suit, had just flipped his whole day upside down. "Are you sure?" Michael asked, glancing through the rearview mirror. Richard nodded. "Yes. I want to see how your day goes. No tricks. No judgment." Michael gave a small chuckle. "All right then. It's not very glamorous. But it's real." They drove through narrow streets, past neighborhoods most millionaires never saw. Graffiti-covered walls, closed-down stores, kids playing with worn-out balls on sidewalks. Richard watched it all, absorbing every detail. Michael broke the silence. "I usually pick up 2 or 3 rides after dropping my son at school. Then I swing by the diner for a coffee, sometimes a sandwich if I've made enough." Richard leaned forward. "And your wife?" Michael's jaw tensed. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. She was the glue that held us together." "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. Michael nodded. "Thanks. It's been tough. But I promised her I'd take care of our son. No matter what." They reached a small diner on Fifth Avenue. The sign was faded, and the door creaked when opened. Inside, it smelled of fresh coffee and old memories. Michael greeted the waitress by name. "Morning, Linda." "Hey, Mikey," she said with a smile, then paused when she saw Richard. Got yourself a business partner now? Michael laughed. Something like that. They sat down. Michael ordered his usual, black coffee and a toasted bagel. Richard, curious, got the same. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Michael said, "You know, I used to be an engineer. Lost my job during the recession. Never bounced back. Had to drive cabs to survive." Richard looked at him. "Why didn't you apply somewhere else?" "I did. Hundreds of times. But after a while, the rejections start feeling like punches. You lose hope. But I had to eat. My son had to eat." Richard nodded slowly. "And yet, you still smiled at him today. You still gave him love." Michael's eyes glistened. "Because he's my reason. He deserves better. And I'll give him the best I can, even if I have to bleed for it." Richard leaned back, speechless. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stocks or deadlines or net worth. He was thinking about life, the raw, unfiltered kind. And in that tiny diner, over black coffee and bagels, two very different men began to understand each other. The cab's engine hummed as the two men returned to the road. Richard sat quietly, the city passing him by like a slideshow of forgotten lives. Michael answered a ride request through his phone and turned toward the south side. "Next stop," he said, forcing a smile, "Mrs. Hanley. Sweet old lady. Takes her to the community clinic every Tuesday." They pulled up in front of a modest apartment building. The bricks were chipped, and a tired dog barked somewhere nearby. A frail woman with a cane stepped out of the entrance. Her face lit up at the sight of Michael. "You're early today," she said with a playful squint. Michael helped her into the back seat beside Richard. "Got a new partner today," he said. "Meet Mr. Blake." Richard smiled politely. "Pleasure." Mrs. Hanley eyed him suspiciously. "You don't look like you're from around here." "No, ma'am. I'm visiting." She chuckled. "A rich man visiting the poor side. I must be dreaming." Michael laughed, but Richard didn't respond. Something about the woman's words struck him. Maybe he was dreaming. Or waking up from one. As they drove, Mrs. Hanley talked about her late husband, her pills, the nurse who always forgot her name. Richard listened. Really listened. And when she got out, he watched her walk with slow, painful steps toward the clinic. "How many more rides today?" Richard asked. Michael shrugged. "Depends on luck. But I'll have to clock out early. Gotta pick my son from school, help with homework." Richard stared out the window. Then, quietly, "Can I meet him?" Michael blinked. "You want to?" "I do." They arrived at a small public school just as kids began spilling out of classrooms, laughter echoing through the open gates. Michael's son, Elijah, spotted the cab and ran toward it with a bright grin. "Dad!" he shouted, hugging his father through the window. Richard stepped out, watching the reunion with a strange feeling in his chest. It had been years since he'd seen his own son. Years lost to business meetings and boardrooms. Michael introduced him. "Elijah, this is Mr. Richard. He helped me today." Elijah extended a small hand. "Nice to meet you, sir." Richard shook it gently. "You too, champ." They dropped Elijah at home, a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a worn-down building. Michael invited Richard up for a quick coffee. Inside, the home was humble but warm. Faded family photos lined the wall. A paper sun hung from the ceiling. Elijah's drawings were stuck to the fridge. "This was her favorite place," Michael said, nodding toward the corner where a chair sat empty. "My wife's reading chair. She used to tell Elijah bedtime stories there." Richard's throat tightened. He turned to the boy. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A doctor," Elijah said without hesitation. so I can help people like Mommy. Richard nodded slowly. That's a good dream. They talked for a while, and then Richard stood to leave. But before he did, he slipped something onto the kitchen table. A card. Michael picked it up. Blake Foundation? My company's non-profit. That's my personal line. Call it. I don't get it, Michael said. Richard looked at him, eyes firm but kind. You said Elijah deserves better. I agree. Let me help. Michael was stunned. Is this charity? No, Richard said. It's an investment. In a future that still believes in love, in sacrifice, in real heroes. Like you. As he stepped out into the fading sunlight, Richard felt something shift inside him, an unfamiliar warmth. The city hadn't changed. But maybe he had. The ride back to his penthouse was unusually quiet. Richard sat in the back of a luxury sedan now, the contrast from Michael's cab not lost on him. The city's skyline glimmered as night crept in, but his mind wasn't on buildings or board meetings. It was on a little boy with big dreams, and a man who gave everything just to keep those dreams alive. Richard walked into his spacious apartment. Everything was sleek, polished, expensive. But for the first time it felt empty. No laughter, no drawings on the fridge, no warmth. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the window. His reflection stared back at him, a man with success, power, and wealth. But beneath it, a loneliness he could no longer ignore. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa, his assistant. Reminder: dinner with the CEO of LexCorp tomorrow. Confirm attendance. Richard stared at the message, then typed back. Cancel it. Reschedule next week. And find a tutor who can help a 10-year-old prepare for a future in medicine. 3 dots blinked on the screen. I'm sorry. You heard me, he replied, setting the phone down. The next morning, Richard returned to Michael's apartment. He didn't call or warn him. He just showed up with 2 cups of coffee and a nervous smile. Michael opened the door, surprised. You again? Hope I'm not intruding, Richard said. I brought breakfast. Michael laughed and stepped aside. Elijah was already dressed for school, munching on cereal. Richard handed him a small bag. Some books I thought you might like. Elijah opened it, eyes wide. Whoa! These are about bones and hearts and science stuff. Michael gave Richard a long look. You serious about this? As serious as a heart attack, Richard joked. I've arranged for a tutor to come by 3 times a week. I'll cover the costs. He's brilliant and knows how to work with kids like Elijah. Michael sat down, overwhelmed. Why are you doing this? Richard looked at Elijah, then back at Michael. Because I wish someone had done this for me when I needed it. Because your story shook something loose in me. And because I want to matter. Beyond money. Michael didn't speak for a while. Then he stood and extended his hand. Thank you, Richard. Richard shook it. No need to thank me. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Don't stop fighting for him. Don't ever give up. Michael nodded, eyes glistening. Never have. Never will. As Richard walked back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The door was still open, Elijah waving wildly. He waved back, smiling. In that moment, Richard Blake, the millionaire investor, realized something profound. True wealth wasn't in the numbers on his bank statement. It was in the difference he could make. And this was just the beginning. Elijah was buzzing with energy. His room, once filled with hand-me-downs and second-hand dreams, now had a small desk, fresh notebooks, and a tablet that Richard had dropped off discreetly. The tutor, Mr. Harris, was a kind, elderly man with a gentle voice and eyes that twinkled when he talked about science. Richard made a habit of stopping by once or twice a week. Not just to check in, but to be there. Sometimes he brought pizza. Other times, he just sat and listened to Elijah talk about molecules or how many bones were in the human body. Michael, at first, watched cautiously. He wasn't used to kindness without strings. But Richard never asked for anything. He just showed up, and that, in itself, was a miracle. One evening, after the tutor left, Richard stayed behind to help Elijah with a science puzzle. Michael made tea in the kitchen, watching the two from a distance. "You're really good at this," Richard said, watching Elijah piece together the organs of a model human. Elijah grinned. "I want to be a doctor. I want to help people like Mum." Richard glanced at Michael. The words hit hard. "Your mum would be proud of you," he said softly. Elijah nodded. "Dad says she's watching us from heaven. I think she sees you too." Richard paused, emotion creeping up his throat. "I hope so, buddy. I really hope so." Later that night, Richard and Michael sat on the small balcony, sipping tea. The city was quiet, a warm breeze flowing through the neighborhood. "I never asked about her," Richard said gently. "Elijah's mum." Michael stared into his cup. "Her name was Sarah. We met in university. She wanted to be a teacher. Smart, stubborn, full of life. What happened? Cancer. She fought hard. But we didn't have the money for the best treatment. I drove day and night, but it wasn't enough." Richard's jaw tightened. He understood now why Michael fought so hard for Elijah. "I wish I had met her," Richard said quietly. "She would have liked you," Michael replied. "You remind me of her in some ways." They sat in silence for a while. "I've got a proposal," Richard finally said. Michael raised an eyebrow. "There's an old property I own, small but decent. Needs some fixing. I'd like to give it to you and Elijah. You two deserve better than this cramped apartment." Michael stared. "You want to give me a house?" "Not give, invest. In a father and son who never gave up. You won't owe me a cent. Just keep raising that boy right." Michael stood, stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Richard said with a smile. "Just say yes." Michael laughed, his voice cracking. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They clinked their mugs together. A new chapter had just begun, for all of them. The first time Elijah saw the new house, he gasped. It was nothing like the small apartment they were used to. The building stood quietly on a quiet street, modest but proud. Its front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint had faded, but Elijah didn't see any of that. He saw space, possibility, a tree he could climb, a small porch where he could sit and read, a backyard where he could kick a football around. Michael turned the key with trembling hands. The door creaked open into a living room with dusty wooden floors, sun-streaked windows, and walls that whispered stories of the past. Michael took a deep breath. "It needs work," he said. "But it's ours," Elijah beamed. Richard had connected them with a contractor, a kind man named Paul who believed in second chances. He offered to help fix the place for a fraction of the cost, even bringing his teenage daughter along to help paint. The days that followed were filled with sweat, laughter, and the smell of fresh paint. Michael, for the first time in years, laughed freely. He painted the walls while Elijah danced to music playing from Richard's portable speaker. Paul fixed the plumbing. Richard built Elijah a bookshelf by hand. "This," Michael said one evening, wiping sweat from his brow, "feels like home." Richard looked around. "It's not just the walls, Mike. It's what you're building inside them." They turned Elijah's room into a little sanctuary, sky-blue walls, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and a desk near the window. Richard brought over a telescope he hadn't used in years. "Elijah's going to be the first doctor who also maps the stars," he joked. Elijah grinned. "I'll name one after Mum." By the end of the month, they moved in. No more noisy neighbors. No more flickering lights or leaky roofs. Just peace. On their first night, they sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. Michael held a cup of tea while Elijah leaned against him, wrapped in a blanket. Richard joined them, handing Elijah a book about astronomy. "You did all this for us," Michael said, breaking the quiet. "I didn't do it alone," Richard replied. "You showed me what it means to never give up." Michael's eyes welled with tears, but he didn't hide them. "You gave us more than a house. You gave us hope." Richard looked up at the stars. "Sometimes, all it takes is one moment to change everything. That hug you gave your son that day, it reminded me what real wealth looks like." The three of them sat in silence, wrapped in a warmth money couldn't buy. Home wasn't made of bricks or wood. It was built on love, second chances, and unexpected friendships. The house had grown warmer, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Laughter echoed through its walls, and Elijah's curiosity bloomed. Each day brought new questions, and every evening ended with stargazing from the porch. One Saturday morning, as sunlight poured through the windows and the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen, there was a knock at the door. Michael opened it, expecting Richard or Paul. Instead, he was met with a face from the past. "Grace?" He blinked. She stood there, holding a small suitcase, her eyes uncertain. Grace was Sarah's younger sister, Elijah's aunt, whom Michael hadn't seen since the funeral. "Hi," she said softly. I hope I'm not intruding." Elijah peeked from behind Michael, eyes widening. "Auntie Grace." Grace knelt, opening her arms. Elijah ran into them, clinging tight. Michael cleared his throat. "Come in." The living room felt tense. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, eyes scanning the room. Her voice was hesitant, almost guilty. "I saw a post online. A news piece about a millionaire investor supporting a taxi driver and his son. I knew it was you." Michael nodded slowly. "It's been a journey." "I wanted to come sooner," Grace said, wringing her hands. "But I was angry. Angry that Sarah died, angry that we couldn't help more. I didn't know how to face you or Elijah." Michael sighed. "You're not the only one who struggled." Elijah sat between them, watching quietly. "I miss Mum every day," he whispered. Grace reached over and held his hand. "So do I, sweetheart." Richard arrived later that afternoon and was surprised to see Grace, but welcomed her with his usual warmth. They all sat around the small dining table, talking for hours, about Sarah, about grief, about healing. Grace revealed she'd been working as a nurse in Abuja. "I took some time off. I wanted to see you both. Maybe stay for a bit. If that's okay." Michael looked at Elijah, who nodded eagerly. "We have space now," Michael said. "And maybe we could all use a little more family." The table fell into a comfortable silence. Richard smiled to himself. A house had turned into a home. And now the home was growing. That night, as the stars returned to their post in the sky, Elijah stood in the yard with Grace and Richard, telescope aimed upward. "Do you think Mum sees us?" Elijah asked. Grace hugged him close. "I think she's proud. Of you. Of your dad. And maybe even of the strange rich man who just won't go away." They all laughed. Richard ruffled Elijah's hair. "You better believe she is." The next few weeks settled into a peaceful rhythm. Grace found comfort in the home's simplicity. She started helping Elijah with his homework, filling the kitchen with her gentle guidance and occasional laughter when Elijah tried to wiggle his way out of maths. One Thursday afternoon, Elijah came rushing home, his school bag swinging wildly behind him. "Dad." Auntie Grace. We have a school project, he announced breathlessly. Michael looked up from the table where he was scanning job listings. What kind of project? Family tree. We have to make one and present it next week. Grace smiled. That sounds exciting. Elijah hesitated. But mine's weird. Mum's not here. And we don't really have photos. Michael and Grace exchanged a look. We'll figure it out, Michael said gently. That evening, they all gathered in the living room. Grace brought out a small box she had kept from Sarah's things, photos, letters, little keepsakes. She placed it on the coffee table and opened it slowly. Elijah's eyes lit up as he saw a picture of his mum holding him as a baby. She was beautiful, he whispered. She was strong, Grace added. And smart. And she loved you so much. They spent hours sorting through memories, laughing at Sarah's silly handwriting and the photo where she wore a Halloween nurse costume. Richard dropped by and offered to help create a digital version of the family tree. We'll make it a masterpiece, he said, pulling out his tablet. Together, they crafted branches for Sarah, Michael, Grace, and even added fun little icons for Richard and Paul, whom Elijah insisted were family too. Michael watched it all, heart full. His son wasn't building a project, he was learning where he came from, and realizing he wasn't alone. On the presentation day, Elijah stood in front of his class. His voice trembled at first, but as he pointed to each name and shared stories, his confidence grew. My mum passed away, but I remember her laugh. My dad is a taxi driver, and he never gave up on me. My Aunt Grace came back to us, and Mr. Richard, well, he's kind of like our superhero. The class clapped. His teacher wiped a tear from her eye. When Elijah walked out of the school gates that afternoon, Michael and Grace were waiting. How did it go? Michael asked. Elijah grinned. I got a gold star. Michael scooped him up in a tight hug. From a distance, Richard watched, leaning against his car. Sometimes, the biggest wins weren't about money or business deals. They were about helping someone else build their story. And this story was far from over. The days after Elijah's school project were filled with small victories and tender moments. Grace settled into the role of aunt and guide, her natural warmth filling the house. Michael, though still feeling the weight of loss, began to notice the little joys again. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Michael took a deep breath and placed his fork down. His gaze lingered on Elijah, who was chatting animatedly with Grace about a new comic book he'd started reading. Elijah, Michael started softly. I've been thinking about something. Elijah looked up, his curious brown eyes wide. What is it, Dad? Michael hesitated, then said, I'm going to start looking into getting a new taxi. Maybe get a better vehicle for work. Something that could help us move forward. Grace's eyes softened. She knew how much this decision weighed on him. That sounds great, Michael, she said quietly. You've done so much for us already. But it's not just for us, Michael replied. It's for Elijah, too. I want to make sure he has opportunities that I didn't. Elijah's smile grew. He looked at his dad with admiration. I think that's awesome, Dad. You're going to be a millionaire one day. Grace chuckled. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Elijah. But the way things are going, who knows? Michael grinned, his heart swelling with pride for his son's optimism. If there was anything he had learned over the past months, it was that with determination and a little bit of help, anything was possible. The following week, Michael took his first step toward buying a new taxi. He spent the day researching various models, weighing the pros and cons. He even spoke with a local dealer who offered a financing plan that seemed perfect. But as he sat in his car that evening, the weight of the decision hit him. Could he really afford it? Was it a risk he should take? The worry began to settle in, gnawing at him like an old fear. The next morning, as Michael prepared to leave for work, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Richard standing on the doorstep, holding a coffee cup in hand. "Morning," Richard said. "Got a minute?" "Sure, come in," Michael replied. Richard walked in and took a seat at the kitchen table, taking a sip from his coffee. "How's everything?" Richard asked. "Good, just, trying to figure things out," Michael replied, sitting down across from him. "I heard you're looking at a new taxi." Michael nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it, but I'm not sure it's the right time. I don't want to put us in any kind of financial strain." Richard's eyes narrowed as he set the coffee cup down. "Michael, if you keep putting off taking risks, you'll never move forward. You've already proven that you've got what it takes. This is just another step." He paused, then added, "If you need help, I'm here." Michael looked at Richard, surprised. "Help?" Richard smiled. "You don't think I've been watching you? You've got a good head on your shoulders, and I've seen you turn things around. Sometimes, all you need is a little push." He leaned back in his chair, taking another sip. "I'm offering to help you get the car you need. A loan, if that's what it takes." Michael shook his head, overwhelmed. "I can't ask you to do that, Richard. You've already done so much for us." "It's not about asking. It's about believing in you," Richard said simply. "You've done more than most. I believe you'll succeed, Michael. You just need to believe in yourself a little more." Michael was silent, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. He had been so caught up in the fear of failure that he hadn't realized how far he had come. Maybe it was time to stop doubting himself. A few days later, Michael went to the dealership. With Richard's offer in mind, he felt a new sense of determination. He signed the papers for a new taxi, a vehicle that was both practical and reliable, just what he needed to take his business to the next level. When he got home, he couldn't wait to tell Elijah and Grace. Elijah was waiting eagerly in the living room. "Guess what, Dad? I finished my homework." Michael laughed and sat down beside him. "That's great, Elijah. But I've got some exciting news of my own. I bought a new taxi." Elijah's eyes grew wide. "You did? That's awesome, Dad." Grace entered the room just as Michael wrapped his arms around Elijah in a tight hug. "We're moving forward, Elijah," Michael said softly. "And we're going to make this work together." Richard, who had just walked in, smiled and patted Michael on the back. "I knew you could do it." That night, as they sat around the dinner table, the future seemed brighter. With every new step, they were carving out a path for a better life. Elijah grinned, feeling the warmth of his family around him. There was no limit to what they could accomplish. It had been a few months since Michael had bought the new taxi, and things had started to feel different. There were still challenges, but there was also hope, a hope that was rooted in the very thing Michael had always fought for, his family. Every early morning and long night spent behind the wheel of his taxi felt like a small sacrifice for a greater cause. One morning, after a particularly busy night, Michael was driving home when he noticed something unexpected. A young man, barely in his 20s, was standing at the side of the road with a suitcase in hand. His clothes were tattered, his face tired. He looked like he had been waiting for a ride for a long time. Without a second thought, Michael pulled over. "Need a ride?" he asked, rolling down the window. The young man looked up, surprised, and nodded quickly. "Yes, please. Thank you. I've been looking for a cab for hours." "Where to?" Michael asked as the young man climbed in. The young man gave an address that Michael knew well. It was a part of town that Michael hadn't visited in years, a place where people were known to struggle. But as the young man settled into the seat beside him, Michael saw something in his eyes, a desperation, but also a quiet determination. As they drove, the young man introduced himself as Ben, a college student who had recently lost his scholarship due to an unexpected family emergency. He was trying to make enough money to get back into school, but the weight of life was pressing him down. "I don't have a lot of options," Ben explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've got to try. I don't want to give up." Michael listened, thinking back to his own struggles. How many times had he felt like giving up? How many times had he thought that he couldn't push through? Yet here he was, with a second chance, driving a new taxi, supporting his son, and building a better future. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility to help Ben, to pass on the good fortune that had come his way. "Tell you what," Michael said after a long pause. "I think you've got a lot of heart. I'll take care of your fare today. And if you're interested, I know a few people who might be able to help you with your situation." Ben looked at him, stunned. "You would do that?" "Yeah," Michael replied with a smile. "I've been where you are. Sometimes, all you need is a little push. You just need to keep going." The rest of the ride was quiet, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Michael could see that Ben was grateful, but he also knew that it wasn't just about the ride or the money, it was about hope. A few days later, Ben called Michael to thank him. He had managed to secure a part-time job and was working hard to save money for his tuition. But it wasn't just the job that made him grateful. It was the fact that Michael had seen him, really seen him, when no one else had. "You gave me something more than just a ride, Mr. Michael," Ben said over the phone. "You gave me hope." Michael smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't do much. Just passing on what I've learned." But as he hung up the phone, Michael realized something important. He wasn't just helping Ben. He was helping himself too. Every time he helped someone else, he was reminded of why he was doing all of this in the first place, to build a better life, not just for himself, but for those around him. Later that week, Michael sat down with Elijah and Grace to talk about the next steps. Elijah had been thriving in school, and Grace had started working with a local hospital part-time. The family was finding its rhythm, and Michael couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. "You know," Michael began, "I think it's time for us to think bigger. I want to invest in something more than just taxis." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Michael paused, the idea forming in his mind. "I want to start a small business. Something we can all be a part of. Maybe a delivery service or even a small cafe. I've been doing some research, and I think it's time we diversify." Elijah's eyes lit up. "A cafe? That sounds awesome." Michael laughed. "I know it's a big step, but I think we can do it." Grace smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "I think you're right. If anyone can make it work, it's you." And as they talked late into the evening, plans started to take shape. They discussed everything from location to menu, and before long, they had a vision for something more than just a business. It was a future they could all build together. The next few months were filled with hard work, determination, and the occasional setback. But through it all, they kept pushing forward. The taxi business continued to grow, and the idea for the cafe slowly turned into reality. Michael couldn't help but feel grateful for the people who had helped him along the way, Richard, Grace, and even Ben. As Michael watched Elijah study at the kitchen table one evening, he realized just how far they had come. What had started as a man struggling to make ends meet had evolved into something far greater, a family united by hope, resilience, and love. And in that moment, Michael knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, one step at a time. If you enjoyed this heartwarming journey of hope, resilience, and second chances, don't miss out on more incredible stories like this. Subscribe to our Daily Stories channel on YouTube and join our community for fresh, emotional, and inspiring content every day. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Let's grow this journey together.